Hi everyone, my name is Charlie and today I have the Women's Prize tag. This tag was created by Simon of Savidge Reads and I wasn't tagged by anybody, but I did say that I would do this tag months ago and never got around to it. I believe that the Women's Prize for Fiction is having its winners announcement tomorrow or today, dependent on when I upload this, but on the 9th of September. And so I've left it rather late to do this, but one question is pertinent to being done this year. With the hair a bit outrageous today, and this being the only clean jumper I currently have, let's embark upon the questions. I suppose that I should also say, back in the day when I first started out reading adult fiction, I used to read a lot more of the Women's Prize books than anything else, simply because I found that a lot of the authors that I liked had been shortlisted for that prize, and also I was poor, and them were some cheap books to get from the supermarket. I know it's not the nicest way to support authors, but at the time it was all I could do. So, firstly, which was the first Women's Prize winner you read? When did you read it and what did you think of it? The first Women's Prize winner that I read was The Lacuna by Barbara Kingsolver, and this was back in 2010. My friend Abercrombie pulled this book off the shelf at the charity shop and told me I ought to read it. And I started it and then just stopped, forgot about the book for about a year. And this was the first year I started recording my reading. And so at the end of that year, I thought I really ought to get onto that. I started it again and read it all in December of 2010, and it fast became one of my favourite books. It is this tale of a narrator in South America who ends up speaking with Frida Kahlo, Diego Rivera, and also talks about communism in America at the time. It's very much built on society's perception of a person and who they relate to, and how being in the same sphere of somebody can actually end up damaging other people's perception of you. I forgot the narrator in this book wasn't actually a real person because he was hanging around with so many real people. And I ended up loving that book, and I haven't read it in the longest time. Barbara Kingsolver's latest works after that haven't impressed me as much as that book did, but that still stands as a book that I recommend to everybody. Next, which author have you read because of the prize who has become a favourite? This is actually Ali Smith, and I haven't read any of the books that she has won with or that she has been shortlisted with, but because of the Women's Prize, her name kept getting mentioned a lot and I kept seeing that she'd won or she'd been shortlisted. And because of that, when I first joined BookTube and people started talking about her more, I decided now was the time to take the plunge. So I read Public Library and Other Stories first, which is a short story collection, and there's a short story in there that I read and reread over and over again before I had to take that book to the library. I have really enjoyed her seasonal quartet, and everything she writes just seems to be so playful with language, and it feels almost like poetry, and there's just a vibrancy and this electricity in her prose that I haven't seen anyone else manage to replicate yet. 3. Which favourite author of yours has yet to win the prize? I don't know whether she's ever been shortlisted or longlisted. I don't know whether her name has ever come up in relation to the Women's Prize, but that is Joanne Harris. If I was going to talk about any writer today that is my favourite, whose works I enjoy so much, who when I talk about, I can't help but exalt her name, it's Joanne Harris. We have a writer who is incredibly creative and imaginative, whose books can't be confined to one genre. And so often, when she first started out, her books were getting labelled as women's fiction. Indeed, I did that myself as a teenage boy, thinking that her books would never be for me. But her books set in Lansquenet with Vianne Rocha are just some of the most immersive books that do what I've talked about with Elizabeth Taylor with the unctuous prose. And then you have the darker thrillers almost with Gentlemen and Players and Different Class. She is able to write twists and she's able to go into the darker aspects of humanity whilst also showing us light and humour with the Gospel of Loki books. And it surprises me that her name has never come up in relation to this prize because she is my favourite writer and I think that a lot of the time people are a bit more disparaging towards her. I should say on that point, if you are an aspiring writer, then Joanne Harris does have a great series on YouTube now about different things to do with your writing and some tasks that you could do. So I'll leave a link to that. 4. Which long-listed, shortlisted, or winning novel has surprised you the most and why? And for me, this is The Tiger's Wife by Taya Obrecht. When this book first came out in 2012, it was highly lauded and remarked upon by tons of people. I love that book. I went to uni and I mentioned it to my tutor. I wrote an essay about young writers because of that book. It had this sense of fairy tale that at the time I really liked and I was seeing talked about more in fiction. I really liked that book as my first foray into adult fiction. However, when I tried to reread it a few years ago, I thought that it was making tons of mistakes that debut novels make, in which the author will try and include absolutely everything and they don't know how to pare it back. And there was just too much and I found it a bit impenetrable upon a second read. I never thought I'd be disappointed by that book, but that's a book where my opinion changed as I read more adult fiction and discovered better works. So my surprise comes from how my opinions could so vastly change about a book within a space of just a few years. 5. If you could be a judge, which 4 women would you judge it with and why? So obviously, I am never going to be a judge of the Women's Prize. So let's replace me with my mother for a second. But let's go with the 4 people I would choose. Firstly, we have Joy Winkler, who is the poet who founded my creative writing group. Me and Joy constantly share books with one another and have discussions about books. And she is one of the people whose opinions I value greatly when it comes to literature. She edited the second Doris book for me, and I really appreciate the way that she talks about books. And so that's number 1. Then we have Joanna Cannon, who is a favourite writer of mine, and I love her work, even though, you know, there are only 3 books there and I hope for more all of the time. I think that we share some similarities in the way that we write, and I know that we don't necessarily agree on all of the books all of the time from what she has posted on Twitter, but that makes for a good judging experience, doesn't it? The ability to disagree and see different likes and dislikes. Similarly, I then chose 2 booktubers. Firstly, we have Sarah over at Hardcover Hearts, whose opinions on books I greatly differ with all of the time, which thrills me as a reader. And Sarah is also one of a great number of eloquent booktubers. I would really enjoy to hear her thoughts on books that would end up being on the shortlist. I mean, we've judged the BookTube prize together this year, and I have really enjoyed seeing her take on books that I haven't necessarily enjoyed. And then another booktuber I included on this list is Olivia of Olivia's Catastrophe. I mentioned in the comments of one of her videos that I just love the way she talks about books, and so if the opportunity ever arose to get to judge some sort of prize with Olivia, I would be thrilled to get into some discussions about books with her. She has some brilliant, insightful comments about books, and I would just love to have that opportunity to share in the discussion with her. And number 6, which lesser known favourite author of yours would you like us all to read, and which book would you recommend? Recently, I got back into reading Elizabeth Taylor, and the first book of hers that I read was Mrs. Palfrey at the Claremont. Now, this was shortlisted for the Booker back in the day, and it is a brilliant book that follows this woman of Mrs. Palfrey who lives at the Claremont Hotel, which is where a lot of older people go when their families aren't necessarily caring about them as much. And so she's retired here, and she's telling everyone that one day her grandson's going to visit. Well, things happen, and she ends up hiring an actor to pretend to be her grandson. It is a brilliant, fantastically insightful book about with older characters, and it's a great book club book. A lot of discussions can be had around this one. It cemented Elizabeth Taylor as a favourite writer of mine, despite the fact that I then went on for years without reading anything else. This is a book that I would recommend that you start with. 7. Which book published before the prize started could have won? Again, I'm going with Elizabeth Taylor, but this time with A Wreath of Roses, which I read last month. This book was originally published in 1949 and follows 3 different women after World War II, all trying to reacclimatise to life, because those few years have kind of changed the certain beats that people's lives should follow, and they're trying to create their own lives. Elizabeth Taylor isn't afraid to go into the psyche of her characters, and she allows the reader to tear them apart. She also writes description in a really fantastic manner. This was called her darkest book. I took it really slowly, despite the fact it's only 200 and something pages, and it is thrilling and dark, and the entire time I was worried about certain characters and the decisions they were making, because as a reader you can see that they're not necessarily doing things that are in their best interests, but obviously you can't climb into a book and tell them that. The tension was high in this one, and I think that had the prize been running in 1949, Elizabeth Taylor could have definitely nabbed it. Which has been your favourite winner so far? Well, actually, I haven't read that many winning books of the Women's Prize, and most of my favourite books are actually books off, the shortlists, as opposed to the actual winners. So therefore, there are only 2 or 3 books that I have read that have been winners. So here we have The Lacuna again. However, I think if one day I do manage to finally read Marilyn Robinson, it could definitely be the book of hers that won. I believe that was just before Barbara Kingsolver as well. Yes, in 2009, Marilyn Robinson won the prize with Home. And one day I believe that I will read these books and they will definitely overtake Kingsolver in my estimation as my favourite winner. Is there a book or 2 published since April 2020 you've read and want to read you would like to see on next year's list? Here we have The Quickening by Rhiannon Ward. Rhiannon Ward is the pseudonym of Sarah Ward, who wrote a 4-part crime series set in the Peak District, and that began with In Bitter Chill and then moved on throughout the seasons. The Quickening is her first foray into a somewhat gothic novel where this woman goes to a manor where a seance famously happened about 30 years before. There's already talk of spirits. I haven't read much of it yet, but I mention this here because Rhiannon is an author who I have worked with in the past, and I would like to take every opportunity to publicise their work. I really do believe that she is a fantastic writer who I've been incredibly lucky to share the stage with before, and whose events I have gone to, and never fails to impress me with the work that they put in. So I would really like to see her get some more credit for what she's creating. But unfortunately, I also don't keep up with a lot of the books that have come out. So right now, maybe Rachel Joyce with Miss Benson's Beetle, but I haven't read that yet either. You know me. I'm behind on all these books. One day I'll properly get good at seeing what books are coming out, but that day's not here yet. Which shortlisted book would you like to win this year and why? I've only read 2 of the books on this year's shortlist: Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo and Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell, and it is Hamnet that I would like to see win out of the 2 that I have read. I have only read 2 books by Maggie O'Farrell previously. I didn't really enjoy them. I have always liked the way that she writes and the manner in which she writes. I think her prose is great, but I haven't necessarily liked the way that she's crafted stories. However, with Hamnet, I did. I enjoyed this book. I found it somewhat poetic. I loved the stories she was telling, how they interwove together. I liked links to Shakespeare, even though his name is never mentioned. This is the story we all know of Hamnet being his son and dying, and I just think it's a great portrayal of grief as well. And I will talk about it more at a later date, but I would very much like this to win over Girl, Woman, Other, only because even though my opinion has changed of Girl, Woman, Other over time, it won the Booker last year, and so I just like to see Hamnet get the recognition I think that it's getting by readers, but that it deserves from this prize as well. Although, of course, any other of the books on the shortlist could be fantastic, and I wouldn't know, because I haven't read them. And I've been waiting for them to come into the charity shop, and that hasn't happened yet. And I can't say out about The Mirror and the Light because I still haven't read Wolf Hall, and I don't know whether I ever will. I do not. And I am not sorry about it. Them's the questions. Them's the books. I hope you enjoyed getting to hear me thoughts on the Women's Prize, despite the fact that I'm not the most knowledgeable about what books are there and what books have come out. Thank you to Simon of Savidge Reads for creating this tag and giving me something to do on a Tuesday morning. And since my brother's making a lot of noise downstairs, I hope you enjoyed this video, and until next time, that is all.